Hello and welcome to our Tips and Techniques videos. I'm Mark Biasotti and we are currently in our advanced modeling episodes. And over the next 30 minutes or so, we'll be exploring how you can increase your skills using some of SolidWorks' more advanced features so that you can be more productive and create higher quality models. So whether you're a seasoned SolidWorks user or a beginner, we think that you'll learn something new in this series. For your convenience, we've listed the topics in the YouTube description that we'll be covering in today's episode, along with a timestamp for each topic in the video. Feel free to skip ahead to any tip or point you want to learn more about. This series is being brought to you by Spanner Product Development, a product development company dedicated to creating positive impact in the world, merging innovation, sustainability, and responsibility to bring meaningful experiences to life for over hundreds of clients. If you want to learn more about what Spanner has to offer, stop by our website at spannerpd.com or email us at hello@spannerpd.com. Now let's get started with this episode of our Advanced Modeling episodes.
Well, welcome to this Tips and Techniques video series. This is episode 21, Photo Rendering, PhotoView 360 Part 1. And in this episode and the following, I'm going to do an overview of PhotoView 360 for SolidWorks for doing photorealistic rendering. It will likely take a two-part episode to cover everything and then some. And after that, I will go into an additional episode on SolidWorks Visualize. So this episode is focused, though, on PhotoView 360. And some of the topics that we'll be covering is what it is and what's the background of it, and how does it compare to Visualize briefly. And I'll talk more about that in the actual Visualize webcast. And then, more importantly, with PhotoView 360, I'm going to outline a successful workflow that I use when I do rendering that will hopefully help you also to better understand how to do photorealism. Then we'll talk a bit about asset preparation, that is decals and textures, things like that that you need to prepare ahead of time before you render. And then we'll get into the all-important subject of lighting and how the model can be best lit for photorealism using HDR. And that, I think, will be all I can cover in this episode. In the following episode, we'll get more into the other parts of the workflow. And so let me just get started then with this episode. So PhotoView 360, what is its purpose? Well, simply it's when you want to depict your digital design photorealistically, or in an image or in animation. So with SolidWorks, you have some level of realism built into the product since 1995. You have OpenGL, which is a simple lighting scheme to shade the model and give you a spatial reference for the 3D object that you're working on. Around the 2007, 2008 timeframe, RealView was introduced, and this is a real-time rendering technique using graphic card technology. There are effects that are built into graphics cards in the mid-2000s that can mimic photorealism. They're not photorealism, they're what I call semi-realistic rendering effects. And you need a a special graphics card to see these effects. Many low-end and mid-range as well as high-end cards can do this, and it's very useful for when you're modeling to better understand the 3D object. But they are not photorealistic. They get close to photorealism, but they're not. Then you have the ability to photorealistically render your model with SolidWorks Professional and Premium using PhotoView 360 or SolidWorks Visualize. This is beyond RealView in that it gives you a physically accurate rendering. That is, photons are bouncing off of surfaces and lighting additional surfaces. You get realistic reflections from the environment, the HDR environment. And there is no special graphics card that's needed. This is all done with the CPU. And that's true for both Visualize and PhotoView. Visualize goes further in that, and we'll talk more about this in future episodes, where it actually can take advantage of multiple CUDA cores on graphics cards to do near-time realistic ray tracing. So this is an overview of what you can do, and PhotoView renderings can be very compelling for marketing purposes, obviously. A lot of products are actually what you look up when you look at the packaging is not the actual product, but it's a photo rendering, believe it or not. This is mainly due to the fact that the product is still being produced or in production before it's even released. So it's a common technique to depict products. I mean, many of the car advertisements you see, believe it or not, are not real cars, but they're photo rendered and animated cars. So very prevalent in today's society and in industry to do this kind of thing. So what is the history of PhotoView 360? Well, PhotoView 360 actually was introduced in SolidWorks 2009 as a standalone product, much like SolidWorks Visualize is today. The goal of it was at that time to make photo rendering very easy and simple to use, and more importantly, accessible by non-CAD users. So you have marketing people whose primary goal was to sell the product, and they needed to depict it as best as possible in a photorealism environment. So this product, PhotoView 360, introduced in 2009, was a standalone product. It was designed by Luxology, which is now the Foundry, and they really created it quite quickly within I think 3-month period. Its motive was really, it was an answer to the Rising Star bunk speed keyshot at that time that was really becoming very popular with industrial designers and product designers for creating renderings of their products. And the PhotoWorks product, which has been in the SolidWorks family since, I believe, 1998 or 7, was becoming outdated. It was not photorealism as is the modern HDRI rendering techniques. So we knew that it needed to be replaced or updated. And it was eventually dropped from SolidWorks, I think, in 2011. So PhotoView at the same time would then become integrated into SolidWorks, not a standalone product anymore. And there was some interesting debates about that. Myself and Joe were wanting to keep it as a standalone product, but the vote won out to put it as an add-in into SolidWorks, so it could be more integrated into the SolidWorks environment. And there's some real good advantages of that, in that a lot of times you have to adjust your model to get the best shot, and having the ability to change geometry and many other things with the photo rendering integrated in that process is a real good thing. The difference between 360 and Visualize. Well, PhotoView, as I said, just now is an integrated product that since 2011 is an integrated product to SolidWorks and Visualize as a standalone rendering application. PhotoView uses multiple CPU cores, like virtual cores. On this machine, this is an AMD Ryzen with 16 virtual cores, so it does a pretty good job for PhotoView. But it only renders using the CPU cores. With Visualize, it takes advantage of both the CPU cores and the GPU cores. And some of the more modern cards, especially the NVIDIA cards, the RTXs, have thousands of cores on them. And so it gives you the ability to be much more interactive with the photo rendered environment. PhotoView, unlike Visualize, is a more mature product, so it has a more mature set of features in it, including animation, the ability to apply appearances to bodies and faces and parts and assemblies. Anything that you can do in SolidWorks as a selection, you can pretty much apply a appearance to. Visualize is more limited in how it can apply materials. It actually relies on SolidWorks. A lot of Visualize users will use SolidWorks to apply their appearances and then go to Visualize to tweak those appearances. Visualize does do animation, but at the cost of another couple thousand, I think $3,000 to have the Pro license to do that, as well as some of the other functions like configurations and whatnot. So the advantage of Visualize, though, is that it is standalone. Can be used by a non-SolidWorks user. It can also bring in more formats, STL, I believe, and is more tuned to SolidWorks and beyond, that is, other CAD systems or other CAD formats. And then the real shining star of it is the ability to use GPU cards with many cores on them to render very quickly and almost near-time, real-time ray tracing. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in the SolidWorks or the Visualize webcast. So talking more about PhotoView, getting back to PhotoView and talking about workflow. This is a workflow that I often use when rendering a product, and it seems to be a successful workflow regardless of what I'm rendering. Of course, you want to make sure that you have all the details in your model. So preparing your model with all the details that you're going to need, or even think you might need, but in the end might not use, is good to have in that model, and have them separated as bodies or parts. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few more slides, but having the model prepared is the first step. And then you need to, before you even start to think about appearances or rendering, you need to also prepare your assets. So when I talk about assets, I'm talking about decals and textures that are pertinent to this product, nomenclature, numbering, things of that nature. And that in itself is its own task, because you want to make sure that they're high quality, high resolution, that they have transparency, and they can be applied correctly. And then before lighting or appearances, applying those assets. So just when I'm talking about our decals, basically, and textures, but placing them on your model and getting them set up so that you can go on to the all-important lighting and appearances and rendering. Then the fourth step is setting up the lighting environment. And oftentimes this is really more important to do than just apply the appearances and then think about camera and lighting, because lighting is probably the most important step and the most important area that you can spend your time on, because it's lighting that makes your model more realistic. Lighting in SolidWorks PhotoView comes from the environment, the HDR environment, the high dynamic range image. And so setting up your model with the proper environment and some actual physical additional lights, although you want to use those very sparingly, really makes the biggest difference. Appearances that are predefined appearances in SolidWorks are pretty good, and if you get the lighting environment right, your appearances will probably work without any alteration. I find that most appearances are pretty good, but if they don't look good, it could be the result of not having your lighting set up correctly. So step 5 would be to apply those, once the lighting is done, is to apply those appearances. And as I say, most of them can be applied directly without any alteration, but one thing you would probably alter with appearances is their bump mapping or texturing and the scale of that, because you have a couple choices there. You can apply absolute size appearance, or you can have the appearance with its bump map applied to scale to the product. And a lot of times that isn't realistic. So I find more times than not that absolute size on appearance is the right approach, because if you have a molded texture, it doesn't vary. It really is set by the Moldtec standard, for instance. On step 5, once you have appearances and lighting, then set up your scene camera with the proper perspective to best render your product. And there's some tips I'll talk about here about golden rule and how best to accentuate a interesting looking shot. And then near final step would be rendering, and that would be to actually render it at high resolution, save it, and then the last step would be post-processing, and this is using a photo editing tool like Photoshop or other photo editor to accentuate and clean up and just make the best shot you can of an image. If it's animation, then it would be After Effects or some other product to process your animation, photorealistic animation, texturing, and the scale of that, because you have a couple choices there. You can apply absolute size appearance, or you can have the appearance with its bump map applied to scale to the product. And a lot of times that isn't realistic. So I find more times than not that absolute size on appearance is the right approach, because if you have a molded texture, it doesn't vary. It really is set by the Moldtec standard, for instance. On step 5, once you have appearances and lighting, then set up your scene camera with the proper perspective to best render your product. And there's some tips I'll talk about here about golden rule and how best to accentuate a interesting looking shot. And then near final step would be rendering, and that would be to actually render it at high resolution, save it, and then the last step would be post-processing, and this is using a photo editing tool like Photoshop or other photo editor to accentuate and clean up and just make the best shot you can of an image. If it's animation, then it would be After Effects or some other product to process your animation, photorealistic animation. So with creating assets, it's first best to get some images of your, if you're reproducing a real life object, get a lot of good references for it of images, and then if you can't find the actual nomenclature for that product, you can go out to the web and look for it. If you cannot find the actual nomenclature in high resolution, like for these Beats headphones, I could not, I actually created it. I actually created the assets from fonts and then did some slight editing to those fonts to make them high resolution, PNG transparent, so I could apply them as decals. Fortunately, I own a pair of these Beats Studio headphones, so I'm very familiar with them. I very much like them, and they're a good subject for this webcast because there's lots of differentiating materials on them. There's metallics, there's leather, there's gloss black, there's rubber. So that combination is just like perfect for exploring how to best photo render a product because of those differentiating materials. I find that if I cannot find the decal in high resolution, that I'll then go and try to recreate the font using some free fonts that you can download. And there's many sites. 1,000 Free Fonts is a good start to look for specialty fonts. And then even if you cannot find the exact font and it's just a one word, you can actually take that font, rasterize it, and then edit it a bit in Photoshop to be very similar to the final product. Creating assets is really important because that adds to the realism, not only lighting, but seeing the product with its proper nomenclature. And we'll get more into showing this in SolidWorks in a workflow, but I wanted to just review some of this ahead of time. As I said before, lighting is probably the most important step that you can take in doing a photorealistic rendering or animation. The lighting in PhotoView comes from the environment, and in PhotoView you have, for both real view and also for PhotoView, you have an HDRI cube map. So it's a high dynamic range image that is mapped into a cube around, in your environment, around your actual 3D object. All the lighting is in your scene, and that is photo rendered, is coming from that HDRI image. And this is what makes, in modern day, in CGI and in movies and in PhotoView, contributes to the realism of the product. Our eyes are very, as humans, we're very used to seeing 3D objects and the subtleties that really subconsciously we don't think about, but the light that bounces off of multiple surfaces and the subtleties of shadows is what we pick up as humans to convey photorealism. And so this is why lighting with HDRI is so important, because lighting can have many bounces and can have many subtleties in how it actually shades the product. So there's a lot of HDRI environments available for PhotoView, and there's even more on the web that if you wanted to create your own custom HDRI environments, you can do that, and you can use those in your photo rendering, and I'll talk more about that in our part 2 episode. So after preparing your model with all the details that you need and then some, the next step, referring back to the workflow, would be to gather up your assets, that is decals, textures, for your rendering. And in this case, we have a number of different nomenclatures on the headphones. We have the Beats logo on the top. We have studio and wireless on the outside, left and right, and then on the inside, left and right indicators for which is left and right headphone. So in this case, I'll just go over to Google and type in the Beats Studio logo, go to Images and Tools and drop down to Large so that we have a good enough resolution for whatever we pick. And it turns out that there aren't any high resolution images at the top of the headphone. So we have to go and find the Beats logo and apply it ourselves. So what I would do is just take something like this and then just crop out and use the Beats logo itself in this particular piece of artwork. So I'm just going to copy this image, go over to Photoshop, and if you start a new Photoshop, it'll start it with whatever's on the clipboard, Control V, and then we can basically just crop out everything else here. And we can get rid of the background, and then we can drop out the white of the Beats itself by using color range white, and it picks everything that's white, drops it out. You can take a closer look at how good a resolution this is. It's not bad. It could be better. In this case, the Beats headphone itself, let me unzip and take a look at what I have here. The Beats logo itself is like a light gray. So we want to just make a full selection of what we have. And I'm not real happy with the resolution here. So I'm going to clean this up a bit by going to modify smooth. Oh, first want to smooth by 2 pixels. And then I want to fill this entire area with a light gray. So I'm just going to kind of drop down to something like this. Edit, fill foreground color. And, you know, actually while I have my selection there, I'm going to inverse it and then make sure I cut any other remaining pixels around that. So now I have my Beats logo. I can save that as a PNG, and that means it has its transparency built into the image itself. And we can go to where I have this broadcast web asset stored in episode 21, and there I have it right there. So I'm not going to overwrite that because I already did it. It's probably just as good. So that's our first asset, and then the remaining ones are pretty much done the same way, except that if it's a particular font like Studio, and I can just show you that. Let's open that. If we go back to our particular folder where we have our assets, and we take a look at, for instance, the Studio PNG, it looks like this. So it's white on the metallic gray. I know that's really hard for you to see. If we just drop in a layer behind it that's black, you'll be able to see it better. And fill that layer. So this is a very proprietary font from Beats, and I had to take something that was very similar when downloading a font from 1,000 free fonts, and then just do a little bit of cleanup to make it look very similar. But anyway, it's the same process. You want to just basically create assets that are PNG, and then you can use them as decals. So let's go back over to SolidWorks, and let's go ahead and apply that Beats on this top face. And we can pre-select the the faces here. And then under PhotoView, Edit Decal, you can browse for that image. And that image is over here in this folder, Beats Studio Appearances, and we're looking for the Beats logo. And we can drop it on there. Now, by default, it comes in as a label map. I would be very wary of label maps. If the geometry changes too much, the label is going to be repositioned. They're the most accurate way to assign a label because they pretty much wrap on the surface. But if the surface that you're applying to is rather flat, or if you have a clear normal view of it, like I do right here, I would recommend, instead of using label, to use projection, and do projection by whatever you see on your triad here. And now we have projection by XZ. So I'm just going to say XZ, and then we have to rotate it by 90 degrees, and then scale it appropriately and center it. So I'm going to put it right about here. And again, I'm referring to my current, now I'm rotating it. I'm referring to my current headphones example for the size. And we need to put it maybe a little bit bigger. And then over in the image, make sure that you have image mask from file selected, so that, use decal image from alpha channel selected, so that now it becomes transparent. And that's pretty much it. And then you want to probably save that decal, and you can do that by saving it to a particular directory. Here you can see I've already created it and saved it as a P2D, and you're done. So there's your first decal. I know it's kind of hard to see because of the model color. So I've gone ahead and applied the other decals, namely the left and right indicators. They're really hard to see because this model by default is a light glossy, white glossy, but you can see them here. Here's the right, and then over here is the left on the inside of the band. The wireless is on this separated band area, and the studio's over here, and as you know, our Beats is up here. So we've got our decals applied. Now it's time to work on lighting. One thing I will often do when coming to lighting is take my model and apply a very neutral matte appearance to it, to first work on lighting and just disregard the different materials. So one that works pretty well is if you go to organic, or I'm sorry, if you go to stoneware and look for the earthenware, and then drop that on the model itself, and disregard the texture for right now. We can go and just remove that. And I'm going to go in here and just go over to Surface Finish and just turn that off, or just remove it altogether. So let me just do that real quick here. Say none. Okay. So now we have just a neutral material. And that's a good thing because we're really at this point just evaluating how we want our scene to be lit. And for this particular shot, I want the headphones to look like they're kind of lying down. So we're gonna bring in or unsuppress a tabletop where they sit, and I can kind of rotate that to show you. And then we can just start evaluating different environments that would be good to light the scene. Now in SolidWorks, the default scene is the 3-point beige, and that's what I think is in there right now. Maybe not. Nope. And that's a really pretty good scene because it's just a 3-point light setup. I want something a little bit more dramatic, and I want something that has some kind of hard light coming in from the left side. One of the scenes I like to use most often when modeling is the one I really prefer the most is the backdrop light studio. And if you drop that in, you get a fairly well-lit model, but it's still not what I'm looking for this particular rendering. I think I'm going to go for something that is more dramatic, and that would be either office space, which has some very direct lights coming from the side, or if you want something even more dramatic, go to rooftop, which is starting to reflect a sunset scene into the scene itself. And you can experiment with these as you go along, and even after you apply materials, you might want to reconsider this. I'll just use the rooftop scene, and then I will oftentimes then just turn off the background, and you can do that by going to colors and then just making the background a plain white. And at this point, we want to turn on some shadows, and then we want to actually go and start to alter that scene, that rooftop scene. So this is one of the annoying things, and I shouldn't have shown you, but when you go to change this, it's going to change the background back to its document scene. It's something I wish that they would fix in the system so that wouldn't happen. But so anyway, that's kind of unfortunate. But anyway, going in, one of the most dramatic things you can do after picking your scene is then go and change the rotation of the environment itself. And if you go over to the Advanced button, you have environmental rotation, and you can see by slowly moving it around, you get different light bouncing at different, the key light bouncing on the model at different angles around the model. And this can be, you can do this using RealView. It's probably better to actually bring up the PhotoView preview window. And I'm going to do that right now. Excuse me. And it's over on my other screen. It's starting to render, but I'll drag it over here. And you don't have to make it large. The smaller you make it, the more interactive it will be. So we're just evaluating kind of the general lighting. So it's probably good to make it something about this size. We're not really interested in detail at this point. We're just interested in lighting. So as I move, I generally experiment with this by going at 45-degree increments or close to it, and then evaluating what it looks like. So here we see we have the light coming in from the left side, more like what I want. And that's probably what I'll go for. I'll go to about 270 to see what that looks like. Here it's even more dramatic. The light is coming from us, so directly in front of the camera, and then back to 0, which is coming in from the right side, I believe. So I'm going to go back to something around 150, which means the light is coming in more from the left side of the scene, or kind of more like the 11 o'clock as we're looking at the scene. And that's what I think I'll settle with. So that's setting up the scene and doing a little of the preliminary lighting for PhotoView. Now we can move on to the part of our workflow for applying appearances. So let's just turn off the table by suppressing it for the time being. And let's go back and make our background white. And let's start working on some materials. So one of the important points and one of the biggest advantages I find with PhotoView over Visualize actually is when it comes to applying materials, you can apply materials to bodies. And The reason that's important is that a lot of times when I'm working on consumer products, at the point of the product development process, we haven't really fully developed the design. We're evaluating it for its industrial design, and that's when rendering comes into play, where we want to show the client what it looks like before we go further in its detailed design. And what that means is that a lot of times these models are multi-body models. This model is a multi-body model that hasn't really been fully fleshed out into an assembly. Now that has, I think, a distinct advantage when photo rendering, because with PhotoView you can actually apply a single material to multiple bodies. Now that's also possible to do with parts in an assembly, but it's a little more arduous to do that. It can be done, but it's very straightforward when you have a multi-body model such as this one here. So we're going to just dive in here, and I have some materials that I've already picked for this, so I won't belabor you with kind of the back and forth of experimenting with materials. And we have a folder here called Beats Appearances. The major material is a light gray that's applied to the bodies of the headband and parts of the earmuffs. So if we go down to finding that gunmetal light finish, and we filter on bodies, and then we start to just drop, let's just drop it on this body here. So what I've done without thinking about it, and I did this on purpose, is I just dropped it. It drops it on the part, okay? But if you're careful about it, and I'm going to just do an undo there, let's turn off our filter, and let's go ahead and drop it here, and then just make sure that when you drop, you're picking the body filter, and that's what I've done there. Once you've done that, though, you can go over to your appearances here, and here we have our satin finish gunmetal light, and edit it. And within this selection box, we have one body selected. Now we can add multiple bodies to this and have that appearance apply to all those at once. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to pick the top of the headband over here, and I believe the inside's dark, but this part here is gunmetal. And did I miss anything? I think I have the gist of it. So with those selected, now you can see I have 5 bodies that are all going, that I can alter the material and tweak it for those 5 bodies, and that's a real advantage. So that's what you have there. Let's move on to the leather part itself, and that comes with its own particular issues. So if we go and find our leather, we have a dark leather here. I'm going to drop that on this body, and then as we've done before, we're going to edit that material, and we're going to include the other bodies in the actual rendering. So it would be these 2 ear pads are the dark leather. The band is actually a different material. It's more like a rubberized material. Now, with some materials like this, you have to pay attention to the actual texturing. And on this leather, it does have texture. And one thing that's a bit irritating is that the scale for texture can be applied in different ways. If we go over to our mapping, we have the mapping is automatic, and that is just basically trying to find best fit for different surfaces at different normals. I find that surface map works much better, so I'm going to change that to surface map. And then this is where it's really crucial. In real view, you get your texture, because it's open. It's driven by GPU and OpenGL. The texture has a different scale than it does in PhotoView. And that's off some cases. Sometimes that's not the case, but oftentimes it is. So with our, you can see the texture here is rather coarse, but over in PhotoView it's rather fine. So if we really scale in, you can see that we have a very coarse texture shown in the real view, but pretty fine in PhotoView. And what I want to be doing is obviously to refer to what it looks like in PhotoView. So that's what I'm doing here. You can do other things, and it looks like I've picked a pretty good one. That's because I've already defined the material, but I did have to experiment with the size of this. And so if we bump it up to something like 100, you can see that it probably is not a realistic size here in PhotoView. So we're just going to go back, and we have it something at like 31.7, which is what we want. So that's probably the right scale for the texture itself. There's other things we can do that can make a dramatic effect. Over in surface finish, you notice that you have the bump strength. So if you want the leather to be very pronounced, we can bump that up to something like 1 and get a different effect in the bump strength itself. And then if you really want to accentuate that, you can actually put in a displacement map, which actually now starts to distort the actual geometry. So when you look on an edge, as if we were to move out here and look at this edge, we should get some rippling effect, and you can see it slightly there. That's due to turning on displacement map. If we turned it off, you get a very even straight line across there. Okay, so I think we've messed with the bump enough. Other things that we can do to accentuate this, if you go to illumination, a really ingenious control, and may not affect this part as much as it would others, is to actually apply a nominal round on all edges, sharp edges of the geometry. And this really further accentuates the realism of your part. That's probably more appropriate to do on the plastic parts than the actual leather part, because I've introduced some pretty large rounds in that already. And then you can play with the diffuse amount. That's how much color is coming through. And in the actual leather texture, I've actually created a leather texture that's more of this bluish gray that the Beats has. And the color is being derived from that. So you can see here you don't have any color pick. And that's because the actual image that's being used for the leather has the color built into it. So you can alter that a bit by going over to illumination and increasing or decreasing the diffuse amount. You can see here that I'm decreasing the diffuse amount, and then increasing the diffuse amount brings in more of the color that's in the image. And then likewise, the specular color, that's the, depending on how much specularity it has, the specular color would usually be a light or a white. And so I want a good amount of specularity, and then you can blur that specularity. So here, it's a little hard to see if we have to get in a little closer. But if you want this to be basically more shiny, then you want to reduce the blurriness and then increase the specular amount. I want something in between, so I'm going to slide my blurriness up a bit and mute that out a little. Okay. Luminous intensity is when the object actually glows like an LED. So we're not obviously doing that on the leather. So that is the leather part. Let's maybe move on to one more material, and that would be the Beats logo itself is kind of a shiny black. So I'm going to go back into my Beats folder, and I think I've actually marked it for that logo. Yeah, right here. So the Beats logo metallic gloss, that's its own body again. So if I drop it on that and then pick body, it actually picks it as a body. And if we look at it over in PhotoView, you can see it's rather shiny and black. Now, this I think will make a really good case for this particular feature of the edge round. Now, what's happening here is that we have actually two differentiating materials. This is a dark black, and then the inner part is a glossy black. So we're going to go, and instead of dropping on a body, we're going to drop on a face. And that's what I just did right there. And if you're really particular about it, you can go and edit that appearance and include the small rounds that are inside of here. For the sake of time, I'm not going to probably do that, but just to show you, if we want all these little faces to be included, because we're on the face filter, we can go in and include those just to be accurate. So I'm going to include those as part of my Beats logo emblem. And there I have it. So this part's the glossy black. This is the gunmetal black. This surface actually right here is the same as this. So we can go to the satin gunmetal light and include this body as part of that. And then this body back here is a dark gunmetal. So we're going to go ahead and drop that in here as a body. And then likewise with the back face of here. So instead of applying multiple same materials to different bodies, now I have pretty much everything I need, and I can just start including other bodies that should be that particular color. So the satin finish gunmetal dark also wants to be including this body, and we have a left and right, so we have to include these also. And for the sake of time, I won't do them all, but we can then focus back in here. So now we're getting something really close to what our final model will look like. Let's go back to the Beats logo that we have in here. And you can also access, in addition to the Appearance Manager over here, you can drop down and find that face or faces here and edit them. And what I want to do is just show you, if we go to Illumination and drop down to the very bottom here where we have the round sharp edges, let's bring it up to like 0.5 millimeters. Okay, did you notice that we now get some highlighting around the actual logo badge here? And that's because PhotoView is adding unto itself its own radius to give some specularity around the badge here itself for the Beats logo. And that's a really interesting feature. It really makes things much more realistic because nothing is absolutely sharp. Most things have a nominal round, and so that's a great trick to add there for that. So I'm running out of time for this episode, and so I'm going to stop here and then pick it up in the next episode where we'll go and refine a bit more of the appearances. We'll talk about setting up the cameras, and we'll talk about rendering and post-production, and maybe even have time to talk about creating your own custom HDR environment. So I'll see you in the next episode.
Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. We hope what you've learned has been informative and can help you to better use some of SolidWorks' advanced features. You'll see in the YouTube description a link to example models used in today's video. Feel free to download it, and you can explore these techniques at your own leisure. Also, we'd love to hear from you, so consider emailing me at the address you see here on the screen. If you need help on your design project or just want to know more about us, stop by our website at spannerpd.com or email us at hello@spannerpd.com. Take care, and I'll see you in the next episode.